Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel where I explore issues related to Hasidic Judaism. With the war in Israel occupying so much of the headlines, you might have heard that many Hasidic Jews are anti-Zionists. Yet you might have also heard that Satmar, perhaps the largest group, loudly decried Neturei Karta, a very small fringe group, for Neturei Karta's participation in anti-Israel protests. Meanwhile, Satmar is often criticized by other Hasidic groups for its anti-Zionism. Yet at the same time, while there are all these different views on Israel among Hasidic Jews, all Orthodox Jews have a deep and abiding attachment to Israel. All of this can be hard to make sense of, especially as we hear a lot about non-religious anti-Zionism, which is quite different from Orthodox Jewish anti-Zionism. And so, in this episode, I hope to demystify and unpack and look back in time by exploring the history of Orthodox Jewish anti-Zionism in all its creases. My guest for today is again Professor David Biale, who I've had the pleasure of having on before. Biale was the lead author of the seminal history on Hasidism called Hasidism, A New History, and that book, among many things, traces quite a bit of the story of Orthodox anti-Zionism, or should I say Hasidic anti-Zionism. So I was happy David agreed to join me on my channel again to discuss this complicated topic. This episode is sponsored by yours truly. I want to use this little so-called sponsorship spot to do a little call for sponsorships. This channel is rather niche. I cover some things that I think are of value or important related to Jewish life and insular cultures, but also the kind of work that is often long form and nuanced content doesn't get a lot of views on YouTube, and therefore I really have to turn to sponsorships to make this channel sustainable. I would love to do sponsorships that I feel I can stand by. To date, I have only had one sponsorship. It was Memoriam of Zelda Meliovitz's family. And otherwise, any shout out I've had on my channel was always not a sponsorship. It was simply something that by chance I brought exposure to. When I do a sponsorship, I want to be very clear when it is a sponsorship, but I also want to sponsor things and people and ideas and products that I can stand by, that I feel are relevant to what I do. So if you think that might be something that would work for you, please get in touch with me. And now back to the program. So thank you, David, for agreeing to do this. How have you been?
Thank you. It's great to be back. I was so pleased to see how many people viewed our previous session. So clearly this is a window into a very, very big audience. Yes.
Yeah. When we last spoke, we were hoping to get your book canceled. Were we successful? Did anything happen there?
From the comments, everybody seemed to be very positive. So I'm afraid we did not get canceled this time.
That's a good thing, I think. Okay, so here's where I want to start. I want to start from the beginning of the Hasidic movement, which predates modern Zionism. And I would like to hear from you what the relationship was for Hasidic Jews to Israel in its infancy before Zionism.
So we know that in the 18th century, there was actually a emigration of Hasidic leaders to the land of Israel in the 18th century. It's really important to emphasize the Zionist narrative has always claimed that there was the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv, and that they were completely separate and different. The new Yishuv being the Zionist settlement, the old Yishuv being traditional Jews, Orthodox Jews, who came to the land in order to imbibe its holiness and be buried there. But in fact, there's a kind of an overlap. The old Yishuv and the new Yishuv were not completely separate phenomena. A lot of the Hasidic groups that came to the land of Israel starting in the 18th century established settlements of their own and were already part of the development of the land for increased Jewish migration. These Hasidic groups contributed to the increase in Jewish population, particularly in Jerusalem. I think that there's always been a motivation of settling in the land, of imbibing its holiness. Actually, it's very interesting. The term Holy Land or Eretz HaKodesh is in fact has a very strange history, which I've been exploring. The term only appears once in the Bible. It does not appear at all in rabbinic literature, in the Talmud or Midrash. And then it suddenly appears with great frequency in the Zohar in the 13th century. And I think that's very interesting, that this term that we all sort of use without thinking much about it, we all speak of, I'm going to go to Eretz HaKodesh, I'm going to the Holy Land, that this term actually has a strange history. Probably in the case of the Zohar, it was to signify that for the Jews, there was a Holy Land, just as there was a Terra Sancta, the Latin term for the Crusaders for the Holy Land. In other words, this idea of the Holy Land may have sort of bounced off of the Crusaders starting in the late 11th century. So we don't find the use of this term very commonly after the Zohar. But then I think in the rise of what we call Orthodox Judaism in the 18th and 19th century, the term recurs, and Jews begin to see the land as holy, as having some kind of intrinsic holiness, which they want to imbibe by going and settling there. The idea of the land as specially holy, which, as I said, starts with the Zohar, I think it's then deployed by Hasidic groups, starting with the advent of Zionism, to distinguish their view of the land from the Zionist view. The Zionist view, even though Zionists use the term Eretz HaKodesh as well, they don't mean by it the same thing. For them, it's a land that has secular meaning. In other words, it's the place where Jewish history began, where Jews are connected in an emotional way, and therefore becomes the site for immigration. But the Hasidic groups that oppose Zionism think of Zionism as polluting the holiness of the land. So this is actually a very important theme, I think, in understanding Hasidic or Orthodox Anti-Zionism.
Can you speak about what happened during the rise of Zionism, Herzl, with regards to how the Hasidic movement understood it?
Well, we're really thinking about the 1890s. Herzl writes his book, The Jewish State, in 1895. He convenes the first Zionist Congress in 1897. Hasidic leaders were very aware of this movement. I mean, the movement initially is really very small. You know, Zionism is a tiny, tiny minority within the Jewish world. But Hasidic leaders, like, for example, Dov Ber, the leader of Chabad Hasidism, they were very aware of Herzl and the movement, and they immediately sought to condemn it. So even though it was very small and not really that consequential yet, they moved to condemn it because they saw it as usurping the role of God in sending the Messiah and creating the messianic return to the land. So we have a number of Hasidic leaders, including the leader of Chabad, Lubavitch, which denounced Zionism very, very strongly and very early on. So they're very aware of it. They see it as a threat, even though in reality it was, at the time, a quite inconsequential movement. It's going to take quite a while before Zionism becomes a real threat by settling the land in large numbers. In fact, realistically speaking, we're only talking about the 1920s and 30s. Zionism starts in 1897, but it's not very successful early on. Herzl dies in 1904, and the Zionist movement does not succeed really politically. It's only really with the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd of 1917, when the British conquer or about to conquer Palestine, that Zionism begins to really take off. So this Hasidic reaction against Zionism in a conceptual sense, in other words, they understand that this movement could become a great threat, even though it wasn't really when it started.
So what was it that they understood was so threatening about this young movement, which I'm sure was sitting in the context of other movements, Jewish movements at the time?
Yes, so I think that the Hasidic leaders understood Zionism as an expression of Jewish modernity. In other words, and they already, decades before Zionism, had fashioned themselves as an anti-modern movement, resisting all forms of modernity that Jews were adopting, including the way they dressed. So for them, Zionism looked like and indeed it was, a kind of secular nationalist movement. So they resisted it as one expression of modernity, as a particularly threatening expression, because not only was it modern and secular, but it also claimed to usurp the role of the Messiah in bringing the return of the Jews to their land.
Can you speak more about that, about how the Messiah, the problem of the Messiah not being here underpins part of the theological rejection of Zionism?
Yes, so the person who gives the most elaborate and well thought out expression to this position is Joel Teitelbaum, the founder of Satmar in the 1920s. Much later on, he's part of a general anti-Zionist atmosphere among Orthodox Jews, and including Hasidic Jews, in this period, but he only really sets down fully worked out views on Zionism in 1957, when he publishes his great magnum opus, Vayoel Moshe. And in this work, he takes on the Zionist movement in many different ways. For example, he denounces the creation of modern Hebrew. So modern Hebrew, which he calls Ivrit, which of course is the term for it, he sees as a completely different language from Lashon Kodesh, from the Holy Tongue, the Hebrew that goes back, centuries and centuries. The fact that the Zionists have created what he considers a new language is symbolic of the fact that Zionism is not really rooted in Jewish tradition. And that's actually a really quite interesting part of his book. Now, the part of his book that is best known and is, in a sense, the most important in understanding his anti-Zionism is his commentary on the so-called three oaths, or the Shvuot. These are three oaths which, according to the Talmud in Tractate Ketubot, the Jews swore to God, and then the nation swore as well. The first two oaths are, first of all, that the Jews will not force the messianic end. In other words, they will wait for God to decide when to send the Messiah, and they will not engage in anything that will force this end before the time has come. The second oath is that the Jews will not emigrate en masse in large numbers to the land of Israel. It's okay for individuals to go there on pilgrimage or to die there, but to go as a mass movement, that violates the second oath. And the third oath, which is the oath that the nations swear to God, is that they will not persecute the Jews too much. Okay? In other words, if they're going to persecute the Jews, it'll be just a little bit, just enough, but not enough to actually destroy the Jewish people. So for Teitelbaum, this third oath is very important, because he believed that because of Zionism, God unleashed the Holocaust. In other words, the Holocaust as a mass destruction of the Jewish people is a response not just to modernity generally, which, by the way, is the view of most Hasidic leaders. In other words, that the Shoah would not have happened if Jews had not adopted modern ways. But in the case of Teitelbaum, He says it's specifically Zionism. By violating the first two oaths, that gave license to the nations, Germany in this case, to unleashing the Holocaust on the Jews. And this is, of course, a very radical view, very hard to accept, right? That the death of so many people, including 1.5 million children, is because of Zionism. This is a very difficult doctrine, but it is the doctrine that Teitelbaum develops in this very important book.
I have such a hard time with this. I'm wondering, I want to pause for a second and talk about it more. In what way was this practically applicable? In what way did various Hasidim who survived the Holocaust, having seen so much loss, including Teitelbaum, lost pretty much his entire community, in what way did they actually feel like this was what was happening, or was it maybe a more theological, abstract explanation and grappling with understanding how God allowed the Holocaust to happen?
Well, it is very theological, but it's also practical. That is, Teitelbaum himself, after the war, he was, the great irony is that Teitelbaum was saved by the Zionists. Rudolf Kastner, who was the leader of the Hungarian Zionist movement, negotiated with Eichmann for a train of some 1,600 Jews to be sent out of Hungary, rather than sent out of Hungary first to the Bergen-Belsen camp, and then later they were released to Switzerland. So these people were saved by this Zionist initiative, and Teitelbaum was one of them. So the great irony is that Teitelbaum, this towering anti-Zionist, is saved by the Zionists. He goes to Switzerland, and then he goes very briefly to the land of Israel, to Palestine, and then he moves to New York. And he moves to New York because I think he conceives of the resurrected Satmar as having its central headquarters really in New York. Now, he does not forbid his followers from living in the land of Israel, but he's generally not in favor. He gives, I think, a certain preference to living in galut, in exile. He does visit Israel, so he doesn't have a problem with that, whereas the leader of Chabad, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh Chabad rebbe, never actually goes to Israel in his many years as the leader of that group. And we might want to talk a little bit about Chabad, which has a rather different position.
Let's talk about Chabad in a minute. I want to ask you a different question still related to Satmar, because I know a Satmar person who has asked me, who has said to me multiple times in discussions of Zionism, which of course everyone's talking about right now, how do Orthodox Jews who are Zionists square it with halacha? I'm no expert, I can't speak to that, but to this Satmar person, it seems like a great contradiction because of the three oaths. So could you speak to that? How do Orthodox Jews, from a halachic perspective, answer Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum's position?
The Ramban, Moses Nachmanides, made settlement in the land a kind of a cardinal mitzvah, absolutely central. In other words, if one can emigrate to the land of Israel, one should, and settling the land is something that is not just desirable but commanded. So, for Orthodox Jews to embrace Nachmanides' position means going to the land, settling there, even if you don't necessarily identify with the secular Zionist movement. And after World War II, many Orthodox Jews went to the land as not only because it was a refuge, but also because it fulfilled this commandment. So it's actually very important to understand that over the years, and particularly in recent years, there has emerged a kind of I would call it ultra-Orthodox Zionism. That is an identification not so much with the secular state, but with the whole idea of a revived Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, and a kind of increasing identification, not so much, as I say, with the secular state, but with the idea of Israel, the state of Israel, as a realization of some kind of divine commandment. And we call these people Chardal, which means Charedi Dati Leumi, or ultra-Orthodox religious Zionists. And this is something that was not conceivable a generation ago, but has become a increasing phenomenon in the ultra-Orthodox world. So you have some of these people who are ultra-Orthodox going and settling in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, Yudav Shomron. You know, this act of settlement is for them a realization of Nachmanides' commandment. And so they find kind of common ground with the religious Zionists who are more modern in their approach. And that means that the categories that we're accustomed to, that is, religious Zionists on the one hand, Orthodox Anti-Zionists on the other, all of a sudden the sort of high wall between these two different groups is beginning to collapse. And we have the emergence of some kind of synthesis between the two.
I want to return, though, to the question about the three oaths. Do they concern themselves, the Chardal or other Orthodox Jews who are more sympathetic to the state of Israel, and do they concern themselves with the question of the three oaths, which the Satmar rabbi believed the state of Israel was violating?
It's actually quite interesting. If you go back in Jewish history, the three oaths don't play a very major role in rabbinic commentary. And even today, I would say, yes, this is Teitelbaum's contribution is to focus on those three oaths. But I think that they don't play a very major role in ultra-Orthodox thinking about Zionism. So if you go and you would interview some of these ultra-Orthodox settlers in the territories, I don't think they would be engaging with that question as a central problem.
What's on my mind at this moment is I want to look at the story of Hasidic Jews and militaries participating in military services, attitudes towards armies, and how it manifests in attitudes towards the IDF.
The Haredi world in general has opposed service in the army. And it's not because they're pacifists. It has to do, I think, more with the sense that the army is a kind of a crucible in which people go in a certain way and they come out a different way. There's a sociologist in Israel, Gidon Oran, who did a study which I thought was fascinating of the body language of Haredim who joined the army. It's been a kind of a small movement of Haredi volunteerism for the Israeli army. This is actually quite interesting of itself. The so-called Nachal Haredi, which is a unit of the Nachal branch of the army. And what Aran studied was he looked at their body language before they went through the basic training and afterwards. He said afterwards you could see a distinct difference in the way they carried themselves. And I think that this symbolizes in a very concrete way the fear of the rebbes of what will happen if their followers join the army. They will come out much more modernized. In other words, the fear is that the army will change their values. And for these leaders, the highest value is, of course, Torah study. And today, as you may know, the number of Jews studying Torah, or Talmud actually, in yeshivas is more than all of Jewish history. In other words, we have this mass phenomenon of what is called the Chavrat Lomdim, the society of learners, in which every ultra-Orthodox Jew is expected to become a yeshiva student. I mean, men, of course. And that's something entirely new in Jewish history. So to allow them to go into the army would be essentially breaking up this society of learners. And so this forms the kind of leadership view of the army. Now, there are exceptions, because, of course, not every man who goes to the yeshiva is really appropriate for that setting. I mean, there are juvenile delinquents, people who just really, their heads are not in Talmud. And so one of the ways in which some of the leaders dealt with these kind of, we might call them marginal figures, was to encourage the army to create a special unit for them. That's the Nachal Haredi. So it's a kind of a outlet valve for people that they really didn't want hanging around the yeshiva. And so there has been small numbers of Haredim who've served in the army. Now, the present situation, the Gaza war, has created, I think, what could be even a revolution in Haredi attitudes towards the military. The latest figure that I've seen is something like 3,000 Haredi Jews have asked to enlist in the army since the Gaza war began. In other words, there's a kind of a sense of national unification of the necessity to defend the state. And a lot of Haredi Jews, I think, are seeing the previous view that they would, their service to the state would be studying as inadequate. And now it's clear that you really need an army to defend yourself. And so we have this very interesting phenomenon of Haredim who volunteer for the army. I should tell you a kind of a little anecdote. This is from years ago, actually. I was in the London airport waiting for an El Al flight to Israel, and there were two men talking to each other. One was a totally secular man from the way he dressed. The other was completely Haredi, Hasidic. That's what he looked like. And they were conversing about different weaponry in the army, tanks and guns and so on. And I was very struck by this. The Hasidic Jew had actually served in the army. Now, I don't know what group he was from, whether it's from Belz or Ger or Chabad, but I was suddenly struck by the fact that there are Haredim who actually volunteered for the army even in the past. Now, it looks like this may be a much larger phenomenon.
It sounds to me from a very far away place like there is, like you said, that wall. Maybe because Israel is moving more rightward, and the Orthodox population is feeling more comfortable in some of the institutions that previously felt more secular.
I mean, I'm not sure about that. I really think that what happened on October 7th, the Hamas massacre, shocked the whole society. And in fact, I try to listen as much as possible to Israeli television to put my finger on the pulse, as well as talking to friends there. And the whole country is traumatized. This is something that we don't fully appreciate sitting outside of Israel, in the case of you and me in the United States. The whole country is traumatized, and so is the Haredi world, I think. And it's created a bridge between the secular and the ultra-Orthodox world that didn't exist before. There was a report from the Ben Gurion airport rather early on in the war, and the reporter went there to interview young men who had returned from abroad in order to take up service with their units in the army. And there were two Hasidic Jews there. And the reporter went up and said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "We're here to greet the men coming back because the time has come really for us to set aside our polemic against the secular world. We're now all in this together, and we need to the whole anti-secular movement on the part of the Haredi world is something that now needs to be set aside." According to these two men who went to the airport. I mean, I'm not willing to say that the whole Haredi world has been totally transformed. I think that's probably not the case, but there is certainly has been a shock to this world and a sense that maybe the army is something necessary and it's not enough to just study in yeshiva.
I have had an experience from the other end of that spectrum, of that bridge, because I was in Israel right before October 7. I came home October 5, and while I was there, I filmed a segment on Bnei Brak. And I was there with a secular couple that did the videography, and we were chatting. We spent the whole day filming, so we had a lot of time to talk, and we were talking quite a bit about how angry secular Israelis are at Haredim because they don't participate in what is felt like the burden of the country. And afterwards, when I spoke to them after October 7, I was checking in. This woman said to me, one of the like bright little specks in this dark time is that this tremendous animosity that everyone was carrying for Haredim, this divide that was happening in Israel between the Orthodox and the secular, was finally sort of released, as there was no time to in her perspective, that tremendous grudge didn't feel it felt much less significant.
We'll see where this goes. In other words, is this only a temporary phenomenon as a result of the shock of October 7th, or is it have long-term consequences? And we'll have to see if that's the case.
Okay, so let's talk about other sects, because we discussed in the previous episode, I shouldn't be saying sects when I speak to you, other Hasidic groups, dynasties, kreisen. Let's talk about them, because we talked about Satmar, and Satmar is probably the most well-known anti-Zionist group, as you said, because of Biale Moshe by Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. What about other groups?
So the largest Hasidic groups in Israel are Ger and Belz, and both of them have found ways to cooperate with the secular state, to serve even in the government. Ger, especially through the Agudat Yisrael. These are groups that I would characterize them as non-Zionist. In other words, their preference would be that the state should be a theocracy. In other words, if that was possible, that's what they would embrace. But they're willing to make certain compromises with the state, partly for pragmatic reasons, to get subsidies from the state for their families. And they're no longer anti-Zionists as they were over 100 years ago, and so we have and it's certain people from these groups had become chardal, who occupy this kind of position in between. For the most part, these groups continue, in terms of their official ideology, to reject the secular state, but in practice, they find ways to compromise with the state. Now, one group that I mentioned earlier, which I think is of great interest, is Chabad. So Chabad in Israel is relatively small compared to other Hasidic groups, compared to Ger and Belz in particular. It's relatively small. It's general around Chabad is smaller than it appears to be, because of course there are Chabad emissaries, shluchim, everywhere in the world. And there are thousands of these Chabad houses. So it actually gives the impression of being a truly mass movement. But probably, realistically speaking, we're talking about 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. I don't know the exact number. It's not huge relative to some of the other groups, which are much bigger. But what is significant about Chabad, of course, is that they are very active in promoting their particular doctrine. Menachem Mendel Schneerson, as I mentioned earlier, never went to the land of Israel. No, he never came to Israel even to visit his Hasidim. His position was very complicated. He was an anti-Zionist. That is, he rejected the state, secular state, and yet at the same time, he celebrated the Israeli army, and he in fact modeled some of his movement on the army. So there are mitzvah tanks, for example. There are campaigns that they fashion, which are look like they're kind of imitations of a military campaign. So it's a very interesting, and he was very opposed to giving back any of the territories that were taken in the '67 war. It was considered to be a political ritual for Israeli politicians like, say, Ariel Sharon to go and meet with the Rebbe of Lubavitch, where he would apparently advise them not to return any territories. So we have this kind of really interesting mix between, on the one hand, a theoretically anti-Zionist position, not visiting the land of Israel even, and on the other hand, this rather militant right-wing view of Israeli policy, as well as a kind of celebration of the Israeli army. So Chabad has this very, very interesting position, and a lot of it stems from their messianism. In other words, Schneerson himself was a little bit cagey. He didn't say he was the Messiah, but he allowed his followers to declare him the Messiah. And even after his death, there are, here I could use the word sect. There's a sect within Chabad that considers him still to be the Messiah who will come back. He's not really dead. He's in, as they say in Shia Islam, an occultation. He's hiding somewhere, and he will come back when the time is ripe. The Meshichistim, as they're called, the Messianists in Chabad, only form a part of the movement. They may not even be the majority of the movement, but they're actually quite dominant in Chabad in Israel, where they, there are signs of long live our King Messiah with a picture of Schneerson. Is part of their public image. In a sense, their messianism builds on the state of Israel. In other words, the assumption is the state of Israel is already the foundation for what will be the messianic state. And in that way, they're occupying a kind of middle position again between Haredi anti-Zionism and religious Zionism. They're beginning to look like Chardal, this in-between kind of movement. So there is a Hasidic leader named Ginsburg, who is a follower of Chabad, but he actually functions in a certain sense as his own rebbe, and he has promoted some of the most radical ideas about settlement in the land, about taking revenge on the Arabs, a very militant view, which rejects the secular state, but promotes the settlements. And he is a kind of offshoot of Chabad Hasidism, Yitzchak Ginsburg.
Can you talk about Neturei Karta, which recently, the Satmar group issued a tweet condemning Neturei Karta for participating in the anti-Israel protests. Shockingly, I don't know, surprisingly to me, carrying posters on Shabbos. I think that was violating the Eruv. So anyway, Neturei Karta is seen as being well out there for doing things like that, to the point that Satmar feels the need to distance itself from it. So can you talk about Neturei Karta? Because I think they are probably the most prominent face of anti-Zionism.
That's right. They are an offshoot of Satmar, actually, originally. So it's quite interesting that Satmar wants to distance themselves from them. Very small group. We're not talking here about anything significant in terms of numbers, but they have a kind of public presence because they will do things like going and meeting with the Ayatollah in Iran and embracing Iranian anti-Zionism. Their position is that they would prefer to live in a Arab or Palestinian state than they would in a Jewish state, because a Jewish state, after all, pollutes the land of Israel, prevents the coming of the Messiah, in their view. These are ideas that actually circulated in Satmar and other groups earlier in the 20th century. In other words, the idea that Zionism was a roadblock to the coming of the Messiah. But because these Neturei Karta kind of radical spin-off from Satmar, are willing to go and meet with some of the most hateful opponents of Israel, this, I think, is generating a kind of a backlash within Satmar itself.
Yeah, well, what's happening in Satmar is, I think, a tremendous mellowing of anti-Zionism for reasons that I can only speculate. I think the younger generation would probably, it's my guess, I might be wrong, they would not connect to the anti-Zionism of the early days of the founding of the State of Israel. There was so much connection to Israel, with people having relatives in Israel, so many ties to Israel. Why wouldn't people feel attached to Israel? Why would they feel connected to this very, very strong anti-Zionism that was, I think, much more resonant in the early days of the state? So I think when it comes to what I'm experiencing in the streets of the Satmar community is people don't have a fire in their belly when it comes to their anti-Zionism. Maybe a few, but most people don't. They, even if they say something, their hearts to me seem to be very, very much warm towards Israel, and concerned, and this one person might be concerned about violence and not exacting revenge. So one person might be more pacifistic and another person might be less so. But I find that the anti-Zionism of the original Satmar Rebbe maybe is more tepid. So that might be why there's such a strong reaction to Neturei Karta.
No, I agree with you, and I think that you put your finger on what is the most important thing, and that is that the personal ties. In the case of Satmar, there is a significant Satmar community in Israel itself, and actually always has been. But as people fly back and forth to weddings, to funerals, etc., there is a sense of connection with the communities living in the land. So it becomes really impossible to totally reject Israel. And I think that's right. I think that there has been a mellowing of that feeling. They obviously would not identify with institutions of the secular state, like the military, but there is a sense in which I would call this actually the emergence of a kind of an ultra-Orthodox Zionism, which is very different, of course, from the Zionism that we're familiar with, but a sense in which the very large population of ultra-Orthodox Jews living in Israel means that you need to care about what happens there. And if there is an event like October 7th, you can't just say, "Oh, that just happened to the secular Jews," which is actually kind of correct, because the settlements on the border of Gaza were generally quite left-wing and secular communities. So you could dismiss that, I suppose, if you are, adhere to the old anti-Zionist ideology. But I think that becomes very difficult now. There's a sense of that we're all in this together, even if, your lifestyle as a secular Jew is completely different from my lifestyle, even as a Satmar Chassid. We're in this together. We are part of one larger community, and we can't pretend as if we are completely separate. So I think that, the recent events have accelerated that mellowing that you referred to. I completely agree with that assessment. You have your finger on the pulse of the Satmar community much more than I do now, but from a distance, that's what it looks like to me as well.
David, I want to go back to the Holocaust, because probably the hardest part to publish about this conversation for me is the Satmar Rebbe's way of making sense of the Holocaust. That is so hard for me to take. That is so inexplicable that I don't know. I think even if I was still a Satmar Hasidic woman, I would have a hard time with that. And I want to talk about how the Holocaust might have been interpreted by other Hasidic leaders in the same way or in different ways. Can we speak to that?
Look, going back all the way to the prophets of the Bible, the central principle of Judaism is, or biblical Judaism, is we are punished for our sins. In other words, if bad things happen to us, it's because we did something wrong. Why was Israel exiled from its land? It was exiled from its land because of its sins, not because it had a weaker army than its opponents. So this is a deeply ingrained idea, and when certain events in the modern period, even before the Holocaust, like the pogroms of the Russian Civil War, from the point of view of a Haredi Jew, of an Orthodox, traditional Jew, is we must have sinned somehow to have brought this upon us. And the sin that's usually identified is modernity. We embraced modern secularism, and we were being punished for that. So that was a fairly widespread view of why the Holocaust happened. It wasn't just, Zionism per se, as in the case of the Satmar Rebbe. But I think that it's not the only view. There was a Hasidic leader during the Holocaust of the Piatchner Hasidim, and his view, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he gave sermons in the ghetto, and his view was a very complicated one. He thought that God himself was being punished. In other words, that God went into a kind of secret place and he was crying with the Jews. In other words, he was trying to understand this event as something that wasn't just punishment for sin. I mean, his sermons occasionally touch on that as well, but he was reaching for a much more nuanced kind of theology in which God is not all-powerful, but God is also a victim of these events. So I think that there's certainly been some Hasidic thinking that goes beyond the what we call theodicy, the punishment for sin. And I agree with you that I think that it's very unlikely that if we look just at Satmar, the average Satmar Chassid would embrace that view of the Holocaust. It seems very unlikely. And I think, by the way, it's important to emphasize that just because the leader has a particular view, that all of its Hasidim necessarily agree with him. There is more autonomy within this community, within these communities, than we give credit for. So I think if you were to interview an average Satmar Chassid and say, well, this is what the founder of the group said about the Holocaust, my guess is most people would say, I can't really accept that. can't accept the death of so many innocent people because of the actions of the Zionists. That seems like a very difficult position to hold.
There is a quote attributed to the Satmar rebbe, which I don't know if he actually said. I think it's apocryphal, that Hasidim, I think, will often repeat, that he said that when a Jew is anti-Zionist, he's correct, but when a Gentile is anti-Zionist, he's anti-Semitic, something to that effect. And it was interesting to see someone posted on Twitter, and a couple of people said he never said that, but people want to believe he said that. If he said it or not, I don't know, but people want to believe he said that. So that tells you also, people are not quite sheep.
I'm a little skeptical that he said that, but it's a useful saying today, I suppose.
Well, let's talk about something that a lot of people are now talking about when it comes to Israel, is the Nakba. Nowadays, when they talk about the story of Israel, that is one of the pivotal central narratives, plot points sort of, that they know and they ask about. So maybe, is there anything we can talk about that moment in history in relation to Orthodox Jews? Because personally, I didn't know about that. It wasn't the story of Judaism where I came from. Obviously, Israel wasn't even a big part of the story of Judaism for me.
So I don't know what the Hasidic attitude towards the Nakba is, or whether they even are aware of it, as you say. And in a sense, we're dealing here with they're kind of dual narratives of the state of Israel. There's on the one hand the Jewish narrative, namely um, the Jews, the United Nations created a Jewish state, and the Arabs invaded with the intent of eradicating not just the Jewish state, but perhaps even, as the slogan at the time was, throwing the Jews into the sea. In other words, a kind of genocidal attack, and that it was really the War of Independence that established Israel's independence from the threat of these Arab armies. And that's the Jewish narrative, and that the flight of the Palestinian Jews was entirely voluntary. They were encouraged by their leaders to leave because they believed they would return in the wake of the victorious Arab armies. Now, the Palestinian narrative is, of course, quite different. And it emphasizes instead that many of these Palestinians were in fact forcibly expelled. Now, what we know from the work of historians is that both of these narratives are true. That is, during Israel's War of Independence, there was an effort to clear away as many Arab villages as possible. And so there were actual expulsions, forcible, violent expulsions. There was also flight. In April of 1948, the Irgun, the sort of right-wing militia, conquered an Arab village called Deir Yassin, and a massacre took place there that's still very debated as to how many Palestinians were killed, Palestinian Arabs, but it may have been several hundred. What's most important about the Deir Yassin episode is that it was widely broadcast among Palestinians that if the Jewish army should conquer your village, they will murder you, even though that was not always true by any means. And so that fear really influenced in many ways the flight of Palestinians. That when the Haganah, the precursor to the Israeli army, approached the village and fired maybe a few mortar shells at the village, people ran for their lives because they were sure that another Deir Yassin was about to happen. So this is a very complicated history, the Nakba. It is very important, I think, if we stand back from the history of Israel, to recognize that from the point of view of the Palestinians, what happened in 1948 was a gigantic catastrophe. 700,000 people fled their homes for Lebanon, for the West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan, and Gaza. What we're seeing in Gaza now, these were almost all of the people in Gaza are descendants of refugees from the Nakba. In my view, peace will only come between Israel and the Palestinians when Israel finds itself able to admit that the Nakba happened. In other words, they don't have to say, we were responsible for every person who left. No, there were people who fled of their own accord from fear, for whatever reason. But I think that it will go a long way for the Palestinians to hear Israel officially say, a catastrophe happened. We played a role in that catastrophe, and we want to make amends. I think that, like in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission played a very major role in bringing the country out of apartheid and into a new era by the fact that whites in South Africa were prepared to admit that they had committed crimes against the black Africans. I think the same thing will have to happen in Israel. And Israel is the much more powerful partner. And to say, we recognize that this happened, we understand what a trauma it is for the Palestinian people, just as we expect the Palestinians to recognize our trauma, whether it be the Holocaust or the Hamas massacre of October 7th. Each side has to recognize what it did to the other side. And so I think that's a very important. Unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Last question pivot. We hear a lot about Christian Zionism. Can you speak about how maybe, because there's been a lot of coverage about Orthodox Jews finding themselves in some kind of partnership with the right of the United States. I'm not sure to which degree I agree with that, but I've seen a lot of academic works recently that have been showing how Hasidic Jews have been more and more, maybe in some ways, aligning themselves with the right or conservatives of the United States. And then we hear a lot about Christian Zionists, very fervent pro-Israel Christians. So has there been any kind of relationship between the Orthodox Jewish world, even the anti-Zionist Orthodox Jewish world, and Christian Zionists?
I think there has, mostly of those Orthodox Jews who are messianists. In other words, if they really think that the Messiah is about to come, this really corresponds to the view of these Christian so-called Zionists who believe that end times are near, and in the end times, the Jews have to be victorious in their land. Of course, what will then happen is many of these Jews will convert to Christianity. In other words, it's a doctrine that most ultra-Orthodox Jews can't accept. But I think on a pragmatic level, they see an alliance here between these evangelical Christian messianists and their own messianism. This would particularly pertain, I think, to Chabad. I don't know exactly what their deep relationships are with the Christian Zionists, but there are relationships for sure, because they are both seeking the same end, even if their theologies are completely opposed to each other. For Jews altogether, and then particularly for Orthodox Jews, the idea that in the end times, so and so many Jews are going to convert to Christianity is, of course, not a tenable position. I mean, they can't accept that. So they don't accept the theology of these evangelical Christians, but they can make a kind of pragmatic alliance with them because they support they're very supportive of the state of Israel as it is, and even the settlement movement and so forth.
So I want to finish this interview by asking you a personal question, if you're okay with it, because we've talked about so many things, and Jew to Jew, I want to ask you if you're willing to talk about how you personally feel about Orthodox Jewish anti-Zionism.
I consider myself a Zionist, actually, although of a very particular kind. So I think that the rise of the State of Israel was a necessary movement in modern Jewish history. I don't think that Jewish history could have played out differently, and so I can't accept the position of the Orthodox Anti-Zionists personally. But as a historian, I find this particular position quite intriguing and important. That is, of how do Jews who remain wedded to the tradition navigate something which is a totally modern movement? I mean, the State of Israel was established by secular Jews, not by religious Jews. And the way in which the religious have to navigate this reality is, to me, quite fascinating. And I'm not at all surprised by the emergence of a kind of ultra-Orthodox Zionism. It makes perfect sense. The ultra-Orthodox world would increasingly identify itself, if not with the institutions of the state, at least with the idea of a state of the Jewish people. So on a personal level, no, I certainly don't accept their position, but I find it, very interesting to study and to learn about it.
Well, it was so wonderful to talk to you again. Maybe we'll talk again some other time. Thank you so much. Should we shout out something where people can read something you recently published? Anything you want to promote?
Well, I think that the main thing is the big history of Hasidism, which I produced together with 7 colleagues. And that really, people will, if they're interested in this subject that we're talking about here, they'll find a discussion of it in that book as well. So it's called Hasidism, A New History, published by Princeton University Press. And it's out in paperback. Actually, you can see an example behind me right here. It's a big tome, over 800 pages.
Yeah,
but
I have it here.
Attractively priced, so it won't set you back that far if you. Yeah. So no, it's.
I saw,
and we've had a lot of readers, including in the Hasidic world.
I saw a reviewer complain that it's literally too heavy to hold when you read.
That's true, but it is a big history because it's not only 250 years, but it's also so many different Hasidic groups that we need to talk about, and we didn't talk about all of them, even in this long book. We were not able to cover everything because there are so many Hasidic groups throughout history, including many groups that have disappeared. We try to cover the most important ones, but there are probably several hundred Hasidic sects that could have been covered. One of our contributors, Benny Brown, insisted at the beginning that every Hasidic court has to be mentioned at least once, but we weren't able to do that.
I wanna thank you again for your time and your insight, and I'm gonna link the book in the video description. And thank you everyone for watching.